This is a gearbox. So all you need for the transmission to work is a crankshaft prop, as well as a gear prop. And it's important that you have a separate gear prop because the E2 will change the inertia on the gear. But if I now actually put this in gear and I just have it on a constant value of 1, have it up, and that's on 10:1 gear ratio. And I can actually change it. And let's go straight to max sure. You can see it rotating a lot faster. But back to what I said about the E2 changing the inertia on that. Actually, if I check the inertia right now, you can see it's 120. If I go back down to 10:1 and overspeed my crankshaft, get the inertia now to 600. So back to how the E2 works. So now for the lower gear ratios, a higher multiplier is used for the error. But in order to make the gear more stable, it also increases the inertia, and that way it makes the gear slip less, pretty much. So if I were to put a rubber block on here, you can see if you look at the crank RPM in the top and the wheel RPM at the bottom there, it's still running at 10:1. And there's a little bit of slip, but there's a lot of friction between this block and this wheel. And it's, for the most part, handling it pretty well. Now you can actually basically tune the gearbox a little bit. So if you go over here, this is the starting gear inertia at 1:1, and we're at 10:1. So of course that's being multiplied by 10. If I get the inertia tool again, or inertia getter, so that's 600. And basically by increasing the inertia, now raising this number, you should be careful with this because it's one of the multipliers used to basically make the gear stronger or more resistant to slip. But it can also start, it can also cause some spazzing back on the crankshaft because the crankshaft might not be able to handle the back torque. Now the gear inertia max is the maximum multiplier of this number, so it can go either way. It can multiply it by 10 or it can divide it by 10. Now gearing down, it actually multiplies, and when you go into overdrive, it starts dividing. And the stock inertia, so this basically determines the strength of your brake force, but it's also the inertia of the gear when it's fully declutched. So I mentioned that gear inertia, it's one of the multipliers used to basically limit the slip of the gear. The other one is sensitivity. Now, I prefer to leave the sensitivity where it is, but basically it does the same thing because the RPM difference gets multiplied by the gear inertia, and the sensitivity is just another multiplier. So in theory, I'm running a gear inertia of 60 stock and a stock inertia of 20. If I were to have these, so 30 and 10, I could run 0.5 and mathematically there'd be no difference. And there basically is no difference. I've noticed, at least briefly, I could run a higher brake force with a lower sensitivity and higher inertia. So your mileage may vary, but these two will determine gear strength. These two can also make the whole assembly spaz out because again, the crankshaft can't handle the back torque. But mainly I recommend you try when you test your transmission, test it at 1:1, because at the higher ratio seems to be what most fast happen. But if you can get it stable at a gear ratio of 1:1, then it should probably be fine. So I guess I should talk about some of the settings, and the two of the more important ones. You can check the alignment of your crankshaft with the stacker, so you can see my engine. Oh, that's actually terrible. My engine rotates to about the up axis, and if you were to get all your axes, you have front, right, and up. So front would be 1, right would be 2, and up would be 3. And if I go in this particular E2, you can see my crank axis is set to 3 because it rotates about the up axis. And also for my gear, if I were to look at it with stacker improved, by the way, because the normal stacker doesn't have this useful diagram on it, but you can see my wheel rotates, or my gear actually. My gear will rotate about the right axis, and that is axis 2. So I've gone ahead and put 3 for my crank axis and 2 for my gear axis, and these should be basically positive. This is the don't put a negative number in there, it'll probably blow up. Now the gear direction, if I were to unfreeze this. Okay. So right now my gear rotates to the left. If that was backwards, what I could do is set the gear direction to -1. And that's basically a quick reverse ratio. It's kind of useful. What else do we have? Clutch power. So probably won't use the clutch all that much, but especially if your gears are stronger, the clutch might be if you wanted to feather the clutch, it'd be you'd put in insanely low values, but basically this tries to make the clutch put in progressively less values near 0, if that makes any sense. But basically engage the clutch slower, so you can see how I laid it out over here. It's the exponent the clutch gets raised to, again, to make the gears engage, or to make the gear engage a little more slower. And finally, we have some gear ratios here. So the first number in here is the ratio index. So if I were to put it in gear 1, this is the ratio I'd get. If I were to put it in gear 6, this is the ratio I'd get. And that's what a reverse gear looks like. And also, again, final drive. So this is a multiplier for all the gear ratios. So if I were to put in, let's say, a final drive of 5, you can see that wheel starts rotating faster. And also, kind of neat is you can see that the there's a curve ratio output on the chip. There's also a few useful outputs on the chips, the inertia and all that. But the curve ratio is the total current ratio that the gear is in, pretty much. So 0.5. So you can see the final drive working. What else? Also, there is a CVT input on the chip, and it's basically you can pass the chip any ratio, and to do that I recommend you do something basically like this. So let me comment these out. Let's say you have 1.0 and a reverse gear. And basically, so basically the CVT ratio is a multiplier for your total gear ratio, and using 1.0 just makes it easy to work with a CVT ratio. That is pretty much an explanation of how to set up the gearbox and get it working. So let me go ahead and default this. Actually, oh dear. Yeah. I also have a tank version of this ship, or version 4 tank. So basically, instead of just one gear, you have 2 gears, and I guess you could use it for a car as well. But you can see you have 2 gear directions and a bunch more inputs. So you have left clutch, left brake, right brake, steer, so you can do differential steering. But basically, these are similar inputs from a ACF gearbox. And again, if you wanted to sort of make like an all-wheel drive car, you could also use this one, and just make sure. So basically, your left gear or right gear would map to like the front and back of the car instead. So I guess there's one way you could do it. But I also have an APC I've been using to test this particular version of the chip, and basically copy the settings over to a single here. And if you just wanted to gearbox, that's pretty much the video, but I can also show you this APC, which I'll put on garysmod.org or something, so you can test it yourself if you want. So let me go ahead and set that up. Alright, so here's that APC I was talking about, and I just threw this together as a test bed for the transmission. It's an old thing I had lying around. But basically it was either this or an actual base plate. But you can see it does have some armor and stuff on it. I just put it on there because, well, basically it was there. But I didn't talk about how to mount your gears. Now you can mount your gears however you want. They don't have to be on the contraption. So what you could do is you just have a setting somewhere and just access the wheels to the setting. But the way I have my wheels constrained to these is via a ball socket that locks the rotation. But because it doesn't really affect the way the tank handles with the sort of inertia I'm running and stuff like that. Let's have a look here. It doesn't really affect the way the tank handles, so what I just did is access the gears to the base plate. And I've parented them. I'm not sure if it actually makes a difference, but they still transmit rotation. And another thing I want to talk about is the weight of the gears doesn't actually matter because the expression is setting the inertia. So weight doesn't really matter. What else? I guess another good thing to bring up is that if you're using 2 gears, make sure they rotate about the same axis because there's no way to change each gear's axis in the E2 that has 2 brakes and clutches. So you can see they share the same axis. If you are interested in taking the APC for a test drive, I want to talk about the controls real quick because it is using a version of my tank chip. Yep. But I wanted to mention that the tank can pivot, but you have to hold space to pivot. And another thing, the handbrake, or really to turn faster, you hold shift instead of holding space. So the controls have changed. But the drive chip is a separate thing from the actual transmission, which is its own unit. So if the tank handles in a kind of weird way that you don't like, you could always like use another tank chip that doesn't handle like trash, basically. But yeah, let's take it for a spin here real quick. I'll debug the transmission. Oh, I think I forgot to do this actually. Derate the engine real quick. I believe it was times 285. There we go. But basically, I believe ACF will derate things similarly. It's like the physical weight over the total weight, because there's parented armor that doesn't actually affect the physics of the vehicle at all. But basically, the tank can pivot, so I have to hold space and hit a direction, and it will start pivoting if you're not throttling. It'll just sort of kill the engine, so you can hear there. But that is using the steer rate to pivot. Another thing that's pretty cool is that this thing turns entirely by the steer rate, or the differential steering. And this is probably my favorite part about the transmission. So it just slows one track down and speeds the other up. So CTMC has a pretty much an auto clutch on it. If you stop hitting any of the movement keys, the clutch will auto engage. But the transmission itself doesn't do that. So one thing I'm trying to showcase here is that you can totally do engine braking going down a slope. And the best way to do that with this particular drive chip, because again it keeps auto clutching, is to just hold the gear by hitting V, so I can hold and release. And I'm just gonna throttle forward down the slope. You can see, even though it's, well, the engine doesn't like that very much, but you're able to use the advantage the engine has to basically slow the vehicle down, which is kind of nice. So let me see if I can show that again over here. So you can see the vehicle doesn't straight up barrel down this down the slope, because the RPM of the wheels and the engine is directly linked. So that's one of the more natural things about the transmission. But I believe that should be it. And basically, have fun.